From kickstarting his MMA journey at UFC 169 and gearing up for the championship belt to his shocking retirement after a fight that put him to sleep within the first minute, here's why Kevin Lee is a pathetic fighter. For starters, he started off his UFC career with insane expectations, thinking he'd end up being the next UFC lightweight champion. And at just 21 years old, he made his UFC debut at UFC 169 in 2014 against Al LaQuinta. And we've all heard those kinds of expectations before, right? Every fighter wants to be the best and a champion, but Lee was definitely a different breed. He's a freak athlete and former college wrestler who stepped into the world of MMA about 5 years before his UFC debut. But before that, he had zero athletic experience. So, how did he make his way to the UFC? Well, that's a story in itself, but all I can say is that it's all about dedication, and that helped him cross the barriers of finance and pushed him to his position within the sport. And right at the start, while his professional record was pretty impressive on paper, it was even better once you take a closer look. Within his first 3 fights, he destroyed Levis Daniel Labry's undefeated record and went on to train for his MMA fight for a whole year. But what sparked this ferocious streak of finishes? Confidence. It geared him up to work with some UFC guys in training and spar with some of the best out there. But don't be fooled by his history of submissions, because it's all about the right strategies and combinations with him. His fighting style's pretty aggressive and punch-heavy, topped with the fact that he can mold himself around his opponent's game or even make them play his. All in all, his journey toward a better career, for a better life, starting off at UFC 169, but it hasn't gone as he expected. Fast forward to 2023, Lee was looking at an epic comeback to prove himself the best in the world. Just think about it. If he had retired right after his last win over Diego Sanchez in March 2022, fans would have remembered him as a talented fighter with an impressive career. He had a record of 19 wins and 7 defeats, where he defeated top fighters like Michael Chiesa and Edson Barboza, and even ended up fighting for a world title. Sure, he's one of the most physically gifted fighters in the UFC, but even with all those skills, he never really used them like he should have. And if you've watched him closely right from the start, you'll know what I'm talking about. Even though he didn't retire at the perfect time, he ended up re-signing with the UFC after he was cut off thanks to the loss to Daniel Rodriguez back in 2021. Now, at 30 years old, he feels he's just entering his prime, and the last few years with a bunch of injuries wasn't what he planned for himself. But even after all of that, he knew this was the right time for his next stint in the UFC. Although, this isn't the first time he said something like that. Even when he was taking the Rodriguez fight, he believed in himself so much that he was ready to say yes to any bout he would have got. But looking back at the fight now, we all know it was just to prove himself. And if you ask me, he's down the same path again. All in all, it's all about the fighter's ego that cost him big time. That said, if he had managed to come out of this with a win, followed by a title, it would have become one of the greatest redemption stories in the UFC. But no one expected Lee to be choked out in the first minute of his UFC comeback. At this point, it all fell apart. And I'm talking about the same fighter who won his first 7 fights in a row right before he was called up to the UFC in 2013. I mean, he wasn't going to come back to the UFC with an easy win, am I right? So he was set up with a top Russian competitor, Rinat Fakhretdinov, to put an end to his success. Just think about it. Lee barely got an opportunity to prove his worth, and he's up against someone with a 19-fight winning streak. But clearly, the comeback didn't last long at all, especially when Rinat wrapped up the fight with striking exchanges and dropped Lee with the guillotine choke. And with that, the Gladiator pushed his streak to 20 with his first octagon finish, thanks to his brutal club and sub stoppage. And now, this might end up being the last memory fans have of Lee under the UFC banner. Honestly, he should have just retired back in 2022 after his last win and wrapped it all up to leave with dignity. But clearly, that window's long gone, and there's no going back on this now. I've got to admit, Lee tried everything to take his opponent down, but there was only so much he could do before he was put to sleep within 55 seconds of total action. If you ask me, he stepped back into the cage way too soon. If anything, he needed to improve his cardio and game plans first, especially with his history of kickstarting the early rounds with a bang, only to slowly fade away by the end. Cardio could have helped him use his grappling skills to pull out the win while his game plan is highly questionable anyway. On top of that, he needs to pick a division and train according to that. But the real question is, what's his ideal weight class? Well, he's definitely struggled to make the lightweight limit, and he's just a bit undersized for the welterweight division, so he's just stuck somewhere in the middle. And if all of that wasn't enough, he also needs to step down in competition. Sure, ever since 2017, he was set up with the top fighters in his division, even though he never reached his actual fighting prime yet. But right now, he's desperate to step down and strike the right balance in his training and fighting if he wants to make his way back to the top and win a title. Otherwise, he'll be left struggling to revive his UFC career. But from what it looks like, I don't think there's a lot left for him to salvage at this point. Because Lee, at the age of 30, which could have become the prime of his career, is standing on the edge with a professional record of 19-8, which isn't what he planned for himself back in 2014. After 12 long years of claiming to be the best fighter, this isn't the kind of end he was expecting for himself. And even if he would have put up a good fight, maybe fans would have let his defeat slide. But after being put to sleep within the first minute, it's humiliating and something he can't ever move on from. But he's found his way around it, because clearly, Lee's UFC comeback is definitely short-lived. So instead, he decided to wrap up his career with his unexpected retirement that left fans shocked. And if that's true, it's going to be a massive wasted opportunity for the same fighter who's trying to prove himself right now. Well, I'll let you know that he's still a bit unsure about hanging up his gloves for good. But right now, he's got another surgical procedure to worry about, which is definitely going to wrap up his career for good. I mean, after his last couple of fights, no one's going to wait around for him to recover and make another disappointing comeback. Instead, the UFC has a bunch of other rising fighters who've got more than what Lee has to offer right now, and it'd be stupid to try and undermine them. Even Lee isn't expecting a comeback right away. The timeline he's got in his mind could be in 2025, or even a decade after his devastating loss. No one can say for sure. Right now, he's going to wrap up his career, even if it's temporary, and focus on healing himself while making money outside the cage. And that's probably the best plan for him right now, because one way or another, he's lost his place in the UFC, and I don't think another comeback is going to fix it now. Not to mention, his unpredictable relationship with the UFC president isn't working out in his favor either. But this time, he's taking White's advice, where he said MMA is more of an opportunity than it is a career, and call it overconfidence or the hunger to succeed. But Lee lost the only chance he had of surviving in the UFC with his brutal defeat. Sure, this retirement was pretty abrupt, but I'm pretty sure fans saw it coming. So there you have it from his shocking retirement after a fight that put him to sleep within the first minute, to kickstarting his MMA journey at UFC 169 and gearing up for the championship belt. That was why Kevin Lee is a pathetic fighter.